investing in being together with us this morning. And would like to ask you to open up your Bibles to Mark chapter 9. Mark chapter 9, we'll be looking there as we consider this passage. I want to take a step back and get some ideas about the context of this passage. Because chapter 9 of Mark is really a pivotal chapter in the story. And not in the sense that it changes everything per se, but especially in the Gospel of Mark, there's so much about the disciples that they're just not getting. They're just not understanding. And this is probably one of the biggest ways that they misunderstand. But as Christians, it's pretty easy for us to take a step back and say, hey, they should have known better. They should have known this. They should have known that. They should have kept that in mind. But we also think about how many things do we miss? How many things do we not get? How many things do we not understand because we're not reading? Because we're not studying? I think about this, and the apostles are in this passage. We note that they are fighting over who is the greatest. And I want to focus specifically on what Jesus is talking about in this passage concerning these little ones who believe in me. What are we talking about there? What's that mean? And when Jesus brings a child in the midst of them, what is he pointing at? What is he trying to get us to think about? Sadly, the apostles are comparing themselves with themselves. And Paul himself touched on this in 2 Corinthians 10 and verse 12, talking about his critics in Corinth. He says, we dare not class ourselves or compare ourselves with those who commend themselves, but they, measuring themselves by themselves and comparing themselves among themselves, are not wise. Very clear that when we talk about our status and where we are, when we start looking at each other to make each other look better or possibly to make us feel worse in comparison, whatever comparison we're making falls flat. Who should we really be comparing ourselves to? It should be the Lord. And we should be thinking about it this way. In this passage, Jesus sits down, as a rabbi does when he's teaching disciples, and challenges their whole worldview. And we have a need to be first. We have a need to want to be the one, to be the guy. When I was younger, I had this thought, and I think most of us do early on, when we start looking at the problems of the world, that somehow we've got to be able to fix this. We've got to get on a white horse and go out there and just fix everything, get everything taken care of. But as you realize over time, that's just not a realistic notion, that you are not any kind of savior or messiah. You literally can't do that. And you realize ultimately that only God can do that. And only God has done that through his son Jesus. I want to look at the parallel passage of this briefly. Keep a marker in Mark 9. And thankful for Brother Bill in reading that. We're going to turn to Matthew 18. Turn to Matthew 18, just briefly. Because I want us to see sort of the parallel passage here. And I want us to really particularly look at verse 5. Focus on that, please. Specifically verse 5. We're going to be looking at Matthew 18, and we'll read in verse 1. At that time, the disciples came to Jesus, saying, who then is greatest in the kingdom of heaven? Then Jesus called a little child to him, set him in the midst of them, and said, assuredly, I say to you, unless you are converted and become as little children, you will by no means enter the kingdom of heaven. Therefore, whoever humbles himself as this little child is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven. Whoever receives one little child like this in my name receives me. I want us to especially note what he says in verse 5. He says something very similar in Mark 9. We talk about greatest and least and things like that. And we're in this business as humans to talk about what's the greatest. We talk about who the wealthiest person in the world is. We talk about what's the greatest nation in the world. And we compare and we contrast. And part of that is us kind of figuring things out. It's not necessarily wrong for us to compare and contrast. When it comes to the greatest, what Jesus is essentially saying is, the greatest is the one who's in the kingdom. And if you're in the kingdom, there is no great and no least. You are one in the kingdom. And so it becomes this picture where it's like, really, how I'm doing compared to someone else doesn't matter in the least. What matters is I need to have this childlike mindset. And I want us to think about that today. As we think back in Mark 9, look back at Mark 9 and just follow with me here. Follow with me as we kind of establish some context here. At the start of chapter 9, I think verse 1 actually belongs in the previous passage in chapter 8. So we start looking at verses 2 through 13 in Mark 9. We see the transfiguration. We see Jesus showing his true greatness. He is changed before their eyes. He has shining clothes, this pure whiteness like no one on earth can accomplish. And while he's transfigured in this way, he speaks with Moses and Elijah, two pillars of the law and the prophets. I mean, literally representatives of the law and the prophets. And how much greater could you get? Can you think about what was going on in their minds? And I think we see that with Peter, who immediately gets it wrong and thinks that Moses and Elijah deserve places just as much as Jesus. Let's build altars for everybody here. But the Father says, "This is my beloved Son. Hear him." Your time of listening for Moses and Elijah are done. Their work is done. But Jesus' work is still going at the time that this is said. And then as they come down from the mountain, they're asking Jesus about Elijah's coming. Why do the prophets say Elijah must come first? We just saw him. And Jesus says, listen, Elijah has come. They've done what they wanted with him. But he challenges them again in verse 12. How is it written concerning the Son of Man that he must suffer many things and be treated with contempt? Stop thinking about Elijah. Think about Jesus. Think about the Messiah. Think about the importance of right now and not this kind of lesser or greater aspect. He gets back and there's a multitude around the other disciples. It's almost like he comes back and there's a fiasco going on. The scribes are disputing with his disciples over something. And he asks what they're discussing with him as if he doesn't know, but he does know. He's asking so that it pulls things to be told. And we find out there's a man from the crowd who had brought his son, who had a mute spirit, who harms the child in seizures. And Jesus is saying in this passage, and early on in reading Mark, I thought that he was just sick of it. I thought that this is a moment where Jesus, he's sick of doing miracles right now. So, faithless generation. No. He's talking about his own disciples. When he says, faithless generation, how long shall I be with you? How long shall I bear with you? Bring him to me. He's disappointed in his disciples that were there. He's disappointed that they did not have the faith to do this. And as we look through, Jesus heals the child. And I think it's important to stress that Jesus heals the child based upon the man's faith. The man says, if you can do anything, please heal him. And Jesus says, if you can believe, all things are possible to him who believes. And look at what this man says. Immediately, one of Mark's favorite words. If you study the Gospel of Mark with me, you know that that's one of the things we bring up. Immediately, the father of the child cried out and said with tears, Lord, I believe. Help my unbelief. This man's prayer should have been the prayer of the disciples. And we all, even today, need to pray for help in our unbelief. And I don't care who you are. It doesn't matter how long you've been a Christian. We all have a measure of unbelief that we need to work on. That what we need God's help in staving back, in working through. Well, why couldn't they cast it out? The disciples asked this after Jesus heals the man's son. Well, Jesus says this kind can come out by nothing but prayer and fasting. Things that are not associated with what mankind thinks about in terms of greatness. You want to be a great man? Well, you want to be, puff yourself up and make yourself look good? Well, it's not going to come about by true prayer and true fasting. You say, well, you can fast and make yourself look good. Yes, that's what we see back in Matthew 6. What did Jesus call those people? He called them hypocrites. He called them people that were making it look like they're fasting and making a big deal out of it. But this kind can come out by nothing but prayer and true fasting. Then we see that Jesus warns them about the crucifixion. He's already done this once in Mark 8:31. He began to teach them that the Son of Man must suffer many things, be rejected by the elders and the chief priests and scribes, and be killed, and after 3 days rise again. And later on in Mark chapter 10, he's going to say this. He's saying, behold, we're going up to Jerusalem, and the Son of Man will be betrayed to the chief priests and the scribes, and they will condemn him to death and deliver him to the Gentiles, and they will mock him and scourge him and spit on him and kill him, and the third day he will rise again. I want us to note as we read in Mark 9 that the disciples in verse 32, they did not understand this saying and were afraid to ask him. Now, if you don't understand something, I think that's okay. I don't think God's going to hold us accountable for not understanding something in the moment. But I do believe God is going to hold us accountable when we're afraid to ask him, when we're afraid to really seek him, when we're so scared to know the truth about something that we don't study it. I believe we're going to be held accountable for that. We need to be very careful and understand and be honest with ourselves. If I don't get this, it's not like God is just going to cast me out for lack of understanding. But he wants me to make an effort. He wants me to ask him. And I believe the disciples could have asked him. But here's the thing. What Jesus was saying to them was the total opposite thought of what greatness means in humanity. This thought of submitting yourself to something that is awful. Willingly giving yourself up to wickedness. Now, I'm not saying that that's something we necessarily do. Jesus did it for us. But there are times, of course, where we don't fight back the way the world fights back. I'm accused of something, I'm lied about. Well, I'm not going to make up some lie to get back at somebody else. If I'm being treated spitefully by somebody, I'm not going to visit that back upon them. That's for God to take care of. I leave that up to him. I leave that vengeance up to him. And so this is what really, I think, helps us to understand. Jesus is not making it easy for the disciples. And he's not making it easy for us either. Because when we think about greatness, we want to think about comfort. We want to think about wealth. We want to think about just complacency and never having to worry about anything. In our society, we have made that a priority. To resist suffering. To push suffering away. To avoid suffering entirely. What does the New Testament tell us? That if we're suffering for the cause of Christ, Matthew chapter 5, Jesus says that, happy are you. For you are suffering in the way that his prophets did, that his faithful did. So that suffering is a context. It's helpful for us to understand this. When they begin to talk about, and they're arguing about who's going to be the greatest, verses 33 through 35. I want to think about that. Right? Verse 34, they disputed among themselves who would be the greatest. I want to ask about that. Who will be the greatest? How would you answer this question right now, right here? Out of everybody here, let's just think about this for a minute. Who's going to be the greatest out of all the people assembled here this morning? I don't think any of us would want to outwardly answer. Inwardly, we might be thinking some things, right? We might be sizing ourselves up against each other right now. We need to be very careful about those thoughts. And I don't ask that question to spur those things in a bad way, but we know those thoughts can lead to pride. They can lead to false glory or to misery. False glory in the sense of trumpeting myself above others, and misery in believing No one has it worse than I do, and there's no way I can be better than anybody else. Both of those are prideful views. This sense of pushing myself over others and also adopting this victim mentality where I'll never get it right, I'll never be good enough, No. Satan manipulates and dominates us in both of those ways. And that's what he was doing with Jesus' disciples. Trying to tempt them away, to encourage them to think about not the glory of the Messiah there with him, but thinking about who's going to have the places of power and the places of importance in this new kingdom. We got to figure out a hierarchy right here and now. And again, I think there's a point where God sort of made us that way. We can see all the way back in humanity that hierarchies, leadership, we kind of do that. And part of that is because we know we need someone to guide us. God has put eternity in our hearts, and so we want this greater to show us the way. And that's God. That's Jesus. That's the proper place to think about that. The troubling thing here is that the disciples don't share these views with Jesus. Much like us, we wouldn't outwardly proclaim or argue about it. But there have been times where we might have thought about it or whispered about it. Well, I think I'm doing better than so-and-so or whatever. Again, I'm not trying to put thoughts in our heads here, but they had argued about it on the road. How shameful they must have felt when Jesus asked about it. Jesus had previously spoke about greatness, his glory in the resurrection of Lazarus in John 11. He talked about his own glory in the prayer in John chapter 17. And perhaps they had some false impression that they should be striving for some measure of glory as well. They're thinking Jesus is going to establish his kingdom. There's 12 of us. I know my hat's in the ring. I've got a place, I've got a seat at the table. I know I'm going to be part of this, administration is what we would think about it, right? Who is greatest? This question reveals a lot. It reveals essentially true ignorance. And the reality of it is that Jesus helps us understand in this passage, my greatness in humanity's terms is truly inconsequential. How many people are going to remember me? There's at one point, recently, we were talking about some things with my family, and I have grandparents that are getting older, and people talking about who's going to get what and things like that. And there's a point you realize, everything that ever belonged to my grandparents, it's not going to be long before nobody's really going to care about any of that. And even beyond that, outside of our family is what I mean. And then beyond that, how about, who's going to care about me in 20 years, 80 years, whatever. You think back to the people that mattered to somebody 100 years ago. And there may be no memory of these people anymore. And we need to realize something. Jesus is eternal. Jesus is the greatness we cling to. And it is sad. It's sad to me when people are forgotten, when history and things like that kind of fall by the wayside. Nobody really cares about it. But the reality is that's still the works of men. That's still the people of the world. And God knows everybody, though. God knows all those people. He knew exactly what was in and out of their life. He knew how faithful they were. He knew how great they were in the sense of the kingdom. But I don't have to. All I have to focus on is, what does God think about me? We're going to revisit some of those thoughts in our application today. I want to talk about the child he puts in their midst. An object lesson. This is Jesus' PowerPoint. He takes the child, he's like, here's your example right here. And, our society caters to children. We make children a priority. And we often think about, we've got to, they're the future. We've got to invest in them. But their society didn't. They didn't think about children as this great commodity. In fact, their thought was very often, can they work in the field or not? If they can't work in the field, there's no use for them yet. They're not old enough, and so they're rather inconsequential. Literally, they were thinking about these little children. They're not strong. They're not wise. They're not talented or self-sufficient. They're totally dependent on others. Others have to help children and shield them around. I mean, part of your job as a parent is just to keep your kids alive. Sometimes that's what I think. It's like, well, this is my job. It's just, I got to keep them alive. But this is the way that Jesus' disciples are to view themselves. And Solomon hit this so well in his wisdom. In 1 Kings 3:7, I know God gave him wisdom. But he had some wisdom at the start, to some degree, right? Where Solomon says, "You've made your servant king instead of my father David, but I am a little child. I do not know how to go out or come in." How many of us are willing to say that? How many of us are willing to say, like, I am a little child in terms of my faith, in terms of my heart? We should be molding ourselves to think that way. And not in the sense where we're just remaining ignorant to things. But we got to start from there, don't we? If I'm going to learn anything in my life as a Christian, I have to adopt this attitude. What does Jesus require of his disciples in Mark chapter 9? He is saying in this passage, back to Mark chapter 9, he's saying, whoever receives one of these little children in my name, verse 37, receives me. And whoever receives me receives not me, but him who sent me. There's a chain here. And he wants them to withdraw from competition. He wants them to be truly converted to become like a little child. Unless you change and adopt this attitude, accept the status of a nobody, accept the status that you're not the one that's important here, become like children, then you're not going to be there. By contending with others over greatness, they're losing their childlikeness. And think of how much greatness that Samuel had. We mentioned Samuel in our Bible study this morning. Samuel didn't compare himself to Hophni and Phinehas, Eli's sons. He didn't say, well, I'm a lot better than they are. But God did. God compared Samuel in glowing terms. And so what I'm saying here is that we need to stop trying to compare ourselves with ourselves, like Paul said in 2 Corinthians 10, and embrace the fact that God knows who I am. And his praise is enough. It's more than enough. It's everything I want. I want God to be pleased with me, just like a child. I don't think there's any greater light that can brighten up in a child's face than to know that their parents are happy with them. They're proud of them. They're pleased with them. And that's a quality we need to emulate. Sometimes it seems like we're just not really too concerned over whether God approves of us or not, whether God is there or not sometimes. Sometimes we make our decisions just based upon purely superficial, secular terms. What's going to be the best place for me to have a job? What's going to be the best thing for me to do? What feels good to me right now to do today? Rather than, is God going to be pleased with where I'm working? Is God going to be proud of the decisions that I make as a family, as a leader of my family, and as someone who is encouraging good things? We begin as a child and we're expected to grow. Children are quickly encouraged to become a big boy, a big girl, right? To quit acting like a child. There comes a time when you put away childish things, right? They're to master their tempers, to master rudeness and stubbornness, to push that away. Self-assertiveness. We expect children to grow up. Yet in Matthew 18, as we read earlier, there's this sense where we are to always remain a child in terms of status, humility, gratitude, obedience, trust, and dependence. Paul said in 1 Corinthians 14:20, do not be children in understanding, however in malice be babes, but in understanding be mature. So there's a bit of a nuance here. In our understanding we grow. We're going to develop. We're going to gain more. We're going to understand and seek God. We're going to know more about his will, more about his gospel, more about his truth. But the attitude, the mindset always has to be, I'm a child of God. I'm not the important one here. That's going to help us out a lot when we talk to people. Because we could go out there, we could just say, to everybody who might disagree with us, well, here's a quick 3-point sermon on why you're wrong. Or I might have a better childlike attitude to say, well, I don't know everything, but I know God's word is dependable. I'd love to talk to you about it. And let that be the guiding aspects of it. As I said, if we refuse to be like children, perhaps you're thinking, some might think at some point, well, that's just not for me. I'm independently motivated. I just have that streak in me. Maybe you're thinking I've got a rebellious streak in me. I've just got to be who I am. Well, sadly, it looks like Jesus is saying in these passages, if you think you're great, I can't use you in the kingdom. If you think you're what I need, I really don't need you. And Diotrephes thought that he was a great man who could decide for himself who belonged in the church and who didn't belong. But he's soundly rebuked in 3 John 9 and 10. Jesus is the one who is the head. He is the head of the body, the church, who is the beginning, the firstborn from the dead, that in all things he may have the preeminence. Preeminence ties with it this idea of importance. He is number one. He is the ruler of the church. And we march to his tempo. We walk in the ways he wants us to walk, as Paul revealed in Colossians 1:18. And so we must accept that I need to be a child of God. Sadly, the disciples then ask about someone else casting out demons, saying, well, he doesn't follow us. Which is just so kind of hilarious in a way. It's like, don't you get it? It's not about following you. It's about following Jesus. But they ask about someone else who's casting out demons. Jesus says, no, this is in my name. People often misunderstand this passage. They'll take this passage, I've heard brethren even say before, that this passage means that we've got to be careful about calling out the Baptists and calling out the Methodists and talking about what they do wrong because, we just don't know. They may be doing good things in God's name. And ostensibly they are. But at the same time, when we think about what Jesus says here, the key to this passage is that Jesus is saying, no one who works a miracle in my name can soon afterwards speak evil of me. I'm looking in verse 39 of Mark 9. Jesus identifies that man as working in his name and striving in that way. So Jesus is really claiming and being clear here. This guy's working for me. This tells us also that there were people in the first century who were prophesying, who were doing inspired things that we know nothing about. And that God was working through them just as much as someone else. But this special group was, of course, the apostles and Jesus, of course. But that didn't mean that they were the only ones doing this, that they were the only ones working for the Lord. There's this emphatic double negative here. This sense of no one, do not forbid him, for no one who works a miracle in my name can soon afterwards speak evil of me. He who is not against us is on our side. And so there is this sense where if you think you need to be in a church so that God can use you for your talent because you think that might be useful, I would just suggest you need to go back and learn humility. You hear people say that today. Well, I can play guitar really well and I can sing really well. And so surely God wants me to use those talents for him. Not necessarily. Some people may be really good at killing people. That doesn't mean that we're going to use that for God's glory. So, Jesus wants his kingdom filled with little children. I want to take a step back. I want us to look at Esther. Look briefly at the book of Esther, please. Esther, we're looking in chapter 3. You remember Haman? You remember the man who was promoted by King Ahasuerus, King Xerxes, the son of Hammedatha the Agagite. He was advanced by him. And verse 2 says, all the king's servants who were within the king's gate bowed and paid homage to Haman, for so the king had commanded concerning him. But Mordecai, would not bow or pay homage. Then the king's servants who were within the king's gate said to Mordecai, "Why do you transgress the king's command?" Now it happened when they spoke to him daily, and he would not listen to them, they told it to Haman, to see whether Mordecai's words would stand, for Mordecai had told them that he was a Jew. When Haman saw that Mordecai did not bow or pay him homage, Haman was filled with wrath, but he disdained to lay hands on Mordecai alone, for they had told him of the people of Mordecai. Instead, Haman sought to destroy all the Jews who were throughout the whole kingdom of Ahasuerus, the people of Mordecai. Imagine not being shown the proper respect and deciding you're going to go about and genocide a person's entire people. It's kind of a crazy thought. I think this guy already has a screw loose. But the sense of greatness that Haman had actually led to a great bitterness in his heart. And it's only because of Esther that things take a change and move in such a positive way in the story, if you remember. Esther is one who's taken in as the queen, and she is able to essentially turn this around and invite, the king eventually honors him with an invitation to a banquet in his honor, right? Now look over at chapter 5. Chapter 5 of Esther. The king has just invited him and said, "I'm going to have a banquet in your honor." Verse 9, "So Haman went out that day, joyful and with a glad heart. But when Haman saw Mordecai in the king's gate, and that he did not stand or tremble before him, he was filled with indignation against Mordecai. Nevertheless, Haman restrained himself and went home, and he sent and called for his friends and his wife Zeresh. Then Haman told them of his great riches, the multitude of his children, everything in which the king had promoted him, and how he had advanced him above the officials and servants of the king." Well, maybe now he can get past this Mordecai thing and just be appreciative of the good things that the king has given to him. Is that the case? Verse 12, "Moreover, Haman said, besides, Queen Esther invited no one but me to come in with the king to the banquet that she prepared. And tomorrow I am again invited by her along with the king. Yet all this avails me nothing so long as I see Mordecai the Jew sitting at the king's gate." Wow. It didn't matter how much he got. What Mordecai did was a stick in his craw from the standpoint that he couldn't stand it, couldn't take it. And this bitterness had consumed him. And it's very sad in a sense. Some brothers and sisters kind of get this way sometimes. They get so caught up in minor affairs that they become miserably bitter. And their lives are ruined by their own pride. It doesn't matter how much God has blessed them. It doesn't matter how much good that God has done in their area. They still get tripped up on some small little thing. Well, they didn't treat me right, or they didn't do this, or they didn't do that. And I'm not defending it when people treat each other badly. But I am saying we've got to recognize that we live in a great kingdom that God has given us. Where God has put us up in a place of importance next to His Son, Jesus. And that should really be the importance of what we're doing here. That should be the central goal of our work. And when something else comes up that distracts from that, we need to be very careful that we don't major in the minors and think about something rather small as being something huge that we just can't get past. And if we can't get past it, maybe it is something that's legitimately a problem. But we can still have an attitude that's better than Haman. And have an attitude that, you know what, I'm a child of God just as much as they are. And if this can't be worked out, it can't be worked out, and we can move forward and find some way to work forward. But I think that's really the point of the passage, is that greatness is not about being better than others. Greatness is not about getting your way. Greatness is not about having things the way you want them to be. In fact, Paul called himself, in Ephesians 3 and verse 8, he called himself less than the least of all the saints. He says, "This grace was given that I should preach among the Gentiles the unsearchable riches of Christ." Paul was a man who was grateful. Paul was a man who was thankful. And so Jesus says, whoever humbles himself as the little child, he is the greatest. Again, we might want to say, well, this child can't do anything. And we might even say the child needs to grow into manhood to enter the kingdom. That's true, but Jesus reverses it. The man must go back and become childlike. God can fill only empty vessels with his gifts. And so this little child, this visual aid, shows us the purpose is not to receive service, but the purpose is to give service. How do we treat these little ones? We welcome them. We receive them. There's no competition. We welcome even one of them, as he says in Mark chapter 9. And the sense of such here, the sense of just receiving whoever is in that sense, you receive all of them in that way. And to receive a child brings us no recognition. A child is illustrated, at least in the kingdom, that he has characteristics of children. And so receiving that child is not some badge of honor for us. In fact, it actually carries a lot of responsibility. When we have brethren who have just obeyed the gospel, that takes a lot of work from everybody. That takes a lot of attention. That takes a lot of focus. And we spend that time with them. But if not everybody makes an effort for that, then that can actually negatively impact that little child. And if we think we're too busy, we've got too much going on, that we just don't have the time to do that, well, that carries with it another problem that really follows through the rest of the chapter. And it's not outright mentioned here in this passage, but I would just focus briefly on pride. Because pride is what makes the little one stumble. He says, if whoever causes, I'm in Mark 9, verse 42, whoever causes one of these little ones who believe in me to stumble, it would be better for him if a millstone were hung around his neck and he were thrown into the sea. If you've never seen a millstone, I know one place you can go. You can go up to Martha Berry College in the vicinity of Rome, Georgia. There's a place toward the back end of the campus, maybe not the back end, it's hundreds of thousands of acres. But there is a place that has like a stream and a little, not a windmill, but a grinding wheel aspect there. I'm totally messing this up. But there is a grindstone or a millstone out in front. It's about yay large, big rock thing, And I tell you, if you have that tied to your neck, and you drop it to the sea, you're not coming back up. And what Jesus is saying is, the person that does that, it's better for them than if you cause a little one to stumble. Now, to stumble is not just a matter of offense. Oh, I'm offended at what you said. It's a matter of you caused them to sin. You caused them to sin. You have brought about a situation where it becomes more easy for them to turn against God. And there are a number of ways that we can do that. But pride, I think, is a big part of it. Pride is independence. This thought that I don't need anybody. I don't need anything. Pride is ingratitude. The self-made man owes nobody. Pride is immodesty. 1 Corinthians 4 verse 7. When he talks about who makes you differ from another. And what do you have that you did not receive? Now, if you did indeed receive it, why do you boast as if you had not received it? These brethren were boasting in things they had no right to be boasting in. And what Jesus is saying is we boast in Jesus. That's what Paul was saying, is we boast in Jesus. Pride is also ignorance. Peter, of course, would deny him. All would run when Jesus was betrayed. Pride defies God. Remember in Proverbs 6, the 6 things that the Lord hates. 7 are abomination, a proud look, a lying tongue, hands that shed innocent blood. We could go on in the passage, but a proud look is very important there. And of course, Peter says in 1 Peter 5, verse 5, that the younger people are to submit yourselves to your elders. Yes, all of you be submissive to one another and be clothed with humility, for God resists the proud, but gives grace to the humble. This doesn't mean that we submit to sin. It doesn't mean that we submit to wickedness. It means that we submit to one another as far as we can. As much as we can. And we need to be willing to give up as much as we have to make these relationships what they should be. To never give up the truth of God, of course. Pride also defiles people. A haughty look and a proud heart and the plowing of the wicked are sin. And of course, Jesus spoke parables to some who trusted in themselves that they were righteous and despised others. One quote says, "The truly proud man knows neither superiors nor inferiors. The first he does not admit of. The last he does not concern himself about." Pride divides up society as well. Where the proverb author, Solomon, says, "The fear of the Lord is the instruction of wisdom, and before honor is humility." Benjamin Franklin is quoted as saying, "The proud hate pride in others." Pride also destroys souls. And we recognize the lust of the flesh, the lust of the eyes, and the pride of life, all of that. This aspect of being proud of our possessions, arrogant about our possessions. Pride will defeat our church if we're not careful. Brother Jeff mentioned Laodicea out of Revelation 3. We don't want to be lukewarm. Pride will lead us to that. Pride will lead us to think we have need of nothing. We're rich, we become wealthy, we have need of nothing. What a temptation in our society. What a temptation in our country. Proud people include worldly people. Think about Belshazzar in Daniel 5. The disciples themselves, as we're talking about right now, arguing over greatness. We see novices mentioned in 1 Timothy 3 and verse 6, that elders are not to be a novice. Pride may attach itself to money. Think about Hezekiah in 2 Kings 20, showing the Babylonians all the wealth he had and all these great things. There was nothing that he had that he didn't show them. And that was a problem, ultimately. National power is tied to that. God's people were warned about the dangers of having a king in 1 Samuel 8. And in Daniel 4, we remember the story of how Nebuchadnezzar was lifted up in his own heart by his own power, and how God had to humble him. We might find pride in social standing, attached to social standing in the sense that Saul, early on, had a lot of humility in his reign. He recognized in 1 Samuel 9, he talked about how his tribe was small, and there's just really no account in that sense. But by 1 Samuel 15, all he's worried about is making sure Samuel accompanies him to offer sacrifices to keep up appearances after his failure to destroy the Amalekites. It might attach us to mental superiority. You think back in Acts 17, how the wise ones that Paul were addressing there on Mars Hill, they were calling him a babbler. They were the credentialed ones. They were the experts. Yet he was the true expert in their midst about who God was. It might attach us as well to religious superiority. If we read in Matthew 6, what are we told? Don't do your good deeds like, sound a trumpet to announce them. There's this restriction in this passage to not let your right hand know what your left hand is doing. Keep it secret. And the goal, really, is to be satisfied for God to know about these things. Well, let's make some applications here as we close our thoughts. First of all, we need to think correctly about God. Turn with me to Isaiah chapter 6. Isaiah 6. Isaiah 6. And you read in verse 1 with me. Isaiah 6 and verse 1. In the year that King Uzziah died, I saw the Lord sitting on a throne, high and lifted up, and the train of his robe filled the temple. Above it stood seraphim. Each one had 6 wings. With 2 he covered his face, and with 2 he covered his feet, and with 2 he flew. And one cried to another and said, Holy, holy, holy is the Lord of hosts. The whole earth is full of his glory. What's called, this is a fancy way of saying, I guess, the Hebrew superlative. It's this repetition where you see, for example, in the Gospels, when Jesus says, verily, verily. The New King James translates that as most assuredly. That's to bring emphasis by that repetition. What does it mean when you go beyond 2? 3 repeated, holy, holy, holy. He is separate. He is different. He is eternal. He is divine. the Lord of hosts, the Lord of armies. And he is high above all this. But what really comes to my mind is this was seen by Isaiah in the year that King Uzziah died. In the 8th century Israel, this 16-year-old young man became king. And he ruled for 52 years. What a great blessing he had. But sadly, his heart was lifted up. We could read more about it in 2 Chronicles 26. But his heart was lifted up. And this man, even though he was of the tribe of Judah, he decided he's going to go into the temple and offer incense before God. He had no right to do that. And the priests are going in, and I give credit to the high priest there, where he comes in and he confronts him about this. And Uzziah is angry. Uzziah basically is about to tell him what he's going to tell him. And then leprosy breaks forth on Uzziah's head. And he realizes this. And the priests rush him out of there because he is unclean. He cannot be in the temple. And the Bible even tells us that at that point, Uzziah himself rushed out. He realized what he had done. And the rest of his life, he lived as a leper. Now, Uzziah was a good man. Uzziah was a good king. The Bible tells us he was a ruler that walked in the ways of his father David. But he made this great mistake because his pride had lifted him up. And it's interesting to me that we see in the year that Uzziah died, this man Isaiah, not Uzziah. I imagine Uzziah would have loved to see what Isaiah is seeing in Isaiah 6. To see the throne room of God. Wow. I mean, it doesn't get much better than that. It doesn't get any better than that. But Uzziah didn't see that. He saw a life of leprosy and ultimate death. And he had lofty ambitions, but it was Isaiah who saw the glory of God. I learned from this that God is not a vessel for my own greatness. God is not some pathway for me to show how great I am or how much I know or how good I am. He's not a tool to magnify myself. Quite the opposite. I'm here to magnify Him. And the beauty of that is it takes all the responsibility off of my shoulders to try to prove something to the world. Because if I'm who I am before God, none of that matters. It doesn't matter if my reputation is thrown through the mud because of my faithfulness. It doesn't matter if I lose my job because of my faithfulness. It doesn't matter if I lose my family because of my faithfulness to God. Because He's the only one that matters ultimately. And I don't relish in that thought of losing those things. But at the same time, I know that's not what it's about. I'm here to praise Him. I'm here to glorify Him. I think we also need to think correctly about ourselves. In Romans 12, look there with me. Romans 12. Romans 12. What a freeing thing it is to think rightly about God and to think rightly about myself. Romans 12 and verse 3. Paul says, "For I say, through the grace given to me, to everyone who's among you, not to think of himself more highly than he ought to think, but to think soberly, as God has dealt to each one a measure of faith." That idea of thinking soberly, that doesn't just mean like, don't drink alcohol. That's not what that's about even. It's about being serious. It's about being serious about this work. That I'm serious about the kingdom. I'm investing myself entirely in this. And focusing on the fact that I belong to Him. Peter had a new perspective on things in Luke 5. Remember when Jesus called upon him, what was Peter's response? He fell to his knees. He said, "Lord, depart from me, for I am a sinful man." We dunk on Peter a lot, but I think that moment is really helpful for us, isn't it? That's how we got to go to Jesus. Not in the sense where we want to depart from Him, but that attitude of, I have nothing to bring to this except myself, right? Blessed are the poor in spirit, for they shall be granted the kingdom of life. So the sense of poor in spirit is that spiritual poverty. That I'm not the wealthy one here. I'm not the one that God needs. I need God. And I need Him in a sense that I need to be consumed with the Lord's holiness. And I need to be consumed and recognize my own inherent unworthiness. And so think correctly about God, think correctly about yourself, and think correctly about others. Jesus did this. Paul says in Philippians 2 verse 3, let nothing be done through selfish ambition or conceit, but in lowliness of mind let each esteem others better than himself. See the strengths and the gifts of others, but recognize your own weaknesses. And again, not in a sense to compare, but in a way to treasure, to honor, to love each other, to appreciate these things. Again, I want us to be careful. I'm not trying to say that in not comparing each other that we can't recognize, boy, I'm really grateful for how well the brother reads the Bible readings or how well the brother leads the singing. Those are good things. And to encourage each other on those merits. Those are good things. But it comes back to, I think, what the NASB, the New American Standard, phrases it. Regard one another as more important than yourselves. If Jesus hadn't thought about that way, he never would have gone to the cross. The cross was an inherent loss for him and an inherent gain for us. And so be thankful that our Lord had such an attitude. And gain that attitude for yourself. Recognize, I'm not the important one here. God is the important one. And the importance that I get and the comfort and the glory that I get is in the way that he shows. Romans 2, Paul talks about that we should seek for glory, honor, and immortality. But not in the way that the world seeks it. In the way that what greater glory, honor, and immortality could we have? Glory, honor, and immortality could we have than to sit at the feet of the Ancient of Days for all eternity, to learn from him, and to praise his name eons upon eons from now. It's a beautiful thought. Let's think about that and consider that. If you're not a Christian this morning, we want to invite you to become a part of God's kingdom, to invest yourself completely and wholly in the truth of the gospel, to obey the gospel. We have water back there this morning. I'm not going to pretend that it's warm, but we can work on that however we need to. If you are ready to be baptized, we want to talk about that and get you there if we can. If you are a member of the body of Christ and you realize something's not right, I need to change something, and perhaps you even feel like you need the prayers of the brethren here to achieve that, to help you and to be there for you, to hold you accountable, and to encourage you in these ways. We encourage you to respond as well. Whatever you need this morning, please come while we stand and sing.